how we promote U.S.-India relations. I'm Jay Gullish. If we haven't met, welcome. Just a little bit of housekeeping. First, we ask that people who are not speaking to stay off video and stay on mute. We will have plenty of opportunities for questions. Also, if you're familiar with the Teams platform, you could raise your hand or populate your question into the chat. We are really excited here today to launch a USIBC SSPI webinar series on commercial space. For those of you who know Lou Zacharella and I, we've been really leaning forward on US-India space for a long time now, but we really think that 2021 represents a huge opportunity, a window of opportunity, if you may, where the government of India is looking at reforming a number of aspects of its space sector. If you flip that around in the United States, for a long time, the United States has been a leader in the commercial space ecosystem, and in many ways is a leader of government to government and international programs in space. So through a series of webinars this year, we want to encourage the governments and industry to find ways that we could work together. From the government to government point of view, there are already a series of existing programs. NISAR is the farthest one along. That satellite is coming together nicely. I hear the payload is on its way to JPL to be integrated to satellite, to be sent back to India to be launched in 2022. And we just, I guess by tradition, the US-India Civil Space Joint Working Group occurs every 2 years. Just by a calendar, that would be later on this year, and by tradition, it goes back and forth, so that would be here in the United States. Of course, with COVID, we have to see how that ramps out. So between now and then, we want to present a series of very thoughtful conversations around topics du jour, where we wholeheartedly believe there's a role for commercial space in the US-India space enterprise. And with that today, we're going to cover two general topics. We're going to cover the new geospatial rules, and we're going to talk about India's human spaceflight program, and a couple of other things that have popped up as well. What we've decided to do is we want to keep this conversational, so we've brought together a panel of experts for a roundtable. We're going to do these discussions in two pieces, one on geospatial for about 15 minutes, and then one on human spaceflight and some other commercial space segments for about 15 minutes. Please feel free to raise your hand, jump in, ask questions during this. And of course, at the very end, we'll have some question answers as well. So with that, I'm really pleased to be partnering with this event and our future ones with SSPI, Space and Satellite Professionals International. I have to plug, there's a new India chapter emerging. I encourage our Indian colleagues to look. It's a really great organization. And with that, Lou, I'm going to hand that over to you, and I'm going to ask that the speakers on the Spacecom portion, if they could come off on video, just so our participants have a better visual experience. So Lou, over to you.
Well, thank you, Jay, and congratulations on organizing this panel. I really want to thank the USIBC for doing this. And as you say, we're going to.
Oh wait, really... Lou, I apologize. I messed this up. I'm supposed to hand it over to Abhishek, aren't I?
That's true, but you notice how I was going with it, you know?
Yeah, my apologies, everyone. Let's call that human error. It's still fairly early here in the morning. I'm going to hand it over to the geospatial panel. My apologies. So I'm going to hand it over to Abhishek Malhotra from TMT Law Practice. And I'm going to encourage that the geospatial panelists do stay on video. And Lou, I will see you a little later. My apologies there.
Absolutely. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Jay. And it's great to have this opportunity to be able to share space on this roundtable, virtually so, with some great lineup of speakers that we have. Just a very quick update for for people joining us from different parts of the world. As Jay had given a great introduction, that we've had a fair amount of activity at the policy level in India in the last little over 7 or 8 months. And a lot of that policy level activity has been directed at commercial space and aspects thereof, which is heartening because this has been on the anvil for a while. And whereas the industry has been hankering for some sort of modifications to 20 plus year old policies, we are finally seeing some movement in that direction. What that movement is, how that impacts businesses, whether it is something which is good only for India or for a collaborative sort of experience with different companies across the world, is something that the great panel that we have got together for you will perhaps share their views on. So without wasting any further time, let me introduce the panelists, and let me start with Mr. William Blair. He's the Vice President and Chief Executive India of Lockheed Martin. He's got a fair bit of experience, of course, in working with the policymakers in terms of getting a sense of what the climate vis-a-vis the regulatory and the policy issues in India are, how it is in terms of, and specifically in the defense sector, which is heavily regulated, which is also slightly opening up. So his views on what exactly the Indian position is, what it is that a business should be looking at when entering into the Indian market with the extant regulations, will be invaluable. We have Mr. Madhav Ragam, who is the Vice President and MD Asia Pacific for Maxar Technologies. Uh, Madhav, we'll be relying upon you for your expert views, specifically in the geospatial, specifically on the guidelines that have been issued for acquiring of the geospatial data and data services. We have with us Jyotsna Jairam. She's a counselor with the TMT group at Trilegal, one of the leading law firms in India. And Jyotsna will be giving us her perspective on what the regulatory position was prior to these guidelines coming into effect, what these guidelines mean for businesses, and what it is that one can look forward to in terms of the challenges that these guidelines pose, and how one can address those concerns within the framework that is already existent, and or to try and figure out whether there is some way that the collaborative effort of the which is being put forward by USIBC and SSPI combined can actually help in businesses take this great policy initiative further. Um, as one of the aspects of the changes in policy, as I just mentioned, is the guidelines for acquiring and producing geospatial data and geospatial data services, including, of course, maps. And this came quite close on the heels of a spate of some other draft policy initiatives that were circulated end of October or November by the government of India. This came in early this year, and it'll be very interesting for us to get to know what the background to this was, what the position was prior to these coming into effect, and what it is, in a nutshell, that these guidelines do in terms of helping out and laying the foundation or a roadmap for businesses in this regard. So may I start with Jyotsna, you, and then perhaps we can go around with getting some inputs from the other panelists as well.
Sure. Thanks, Abhishek, and it's great to be here. Thank you for having me. So just very quickly, I think that we all probably know, but historically, the activity of map making, as well as anything concerned with geospatial data, has been reserved for the Survey of India. So if you go back to some of the regulation that has even existed from the time of the British, it seems to suggest that the only sort of body that can create maps and collect, use, disseminate geospatial data is the Survey of India. The closest thing that we had to a law as far as map making was concerned was the National Map Policy, which broadly stated out the objectives that the government had with respect to map making. However, the guidelines for the implementation of the policy had some more specifics. And if you read the both of them together, what it ultimately boiled down to was anybody else who wanted to engage in map making or collecting geospatial data would have to do so under one of the 5 licenses that the SOI was issuing at that point of time. There was a little bit of confusion because it seemed like only if you are using SOI maps, which several technologies do not do today, you would need these licenses. But safe to say there was some ambiguity. In addition to this, you also had requirements strewn across various ministries and departments that would issue specific restrictions in relation to either the export of maps or areas you can capture as a part of your mapping activity, or for instance, even the acquisition of data. So one of this, of course, is the remote sensing data policy issued by the Department of Space, which I know is being reworked now. But based on what exists today, you do need specific approvals to actually acquire satellite data. So the regime per se was scattered amongst various office memoranda, notifications, policies and guidelines issued by various departments and ministries. But what the guidelines do now is sort of consolidate that effort and in fact clearly state that it will be the single point of reference. There has to be some act, of course, to supersede and to rescind the existing laws, and we can talk about that. But it does provide a one-stop shop in that sense for all things concerned with geospatial data, and does seem to open it up largely to the private sector. But of course, there's a very clear distinction in how it treats foreign companies and Indian companies, and I'm sure we'll get to that over the course of this discussion.
Thank you so much, Jyotsna, for that great summary and encapsulating what the prior position was and what it is that we can expect. Madhav, your quick views on these guidelines in terms of what it does for business and how do you think that this will really help, among others, Maxar and the businesses that are looking at geospatial data in this?
Yeah, thank you, Abhishek. I think as Jyotsna pointed out, at last count, we were looking at least 15 national policies that governed geospatial information in India, right? And every time a new policy was introduced, it did not mention what happened to the previous policy, right? And that's exactly the point that Jyotsna was making. Hopefully, this time around, it's loud and clear that this is since all the previous ones, and we can move forward on that. Right. I just wanted to give you an example of the kinds of conflicts that we were seeing as the industry players, right? If you look at the map policy of Ministry of Defense, right, that needs to be synchronized with the remote sensing policy that is coming up, right? And since all inputs for mapping originate at some place or the other from a satellite image-based base map, right? And having two separate policies which overlap sometimes and create conflicting viewpoints in other instances is only going to hinder the innovation capability that the industry can bring into India, right? So that's just one side of view of the things. But overall, I think the industry is overjoyed that this long-awaited reform is happening. But as industry observers usually are, the devil is always in the detail. And we want to see that the remote sensing data policy that is expected to come out very soon as well kind of dovetails very well into this geospatial thing. We hope that there is no splinters that come in the way as we try and dovetail the two together, right? But that's where I think we can talk a little bit more about the specific areas that we are hoping there would be change there.
Sure. Thanks so much. Bill, what's been your experience, and specifically, I want you to sort of comment a little bit on whereas there seems to be clearly an attempt to liberalize the policy regulatory regime overall across various sectors, and specifically what we're talking about here in the Spacecom sort of domain. But there seems to be a guarded sort of modification to the last position, in as much as there seems to be only an opening up, so as to speak, for Indian companies. So your thoughts on this particular approach? Yes, it is. I understand that it is in keeping with the overall policy of self-reliance, but is it some sort of a concern that foreign companies should be looking out for? How do they overcome that? What's been your experience in this regard?
No, thank you, Abhishek. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I'd lead off by saying, well, one, I'm not an expert on geospatial, but I've been in India now in several different roles over the last few decades. And so I've seen the evolution of, markets opening up when I was here, even in the 1990s, to then what we've seen more recently in the defense domain. But I came to India out of a role in Lockheed Martin Space out of Denver, Colorado, and have a real appreciation for the technologies that we're talking about. But if I go back and see the announcement in February with the geospatial guidelines coming out, the focus is on, at least from what Prime Minister Modi said, focus on boosting the economy, advance self-reliance, and enable co-ownership of national ambition is what I read. And a recognition that geospatial data includes, local location information. It's integral to the modern digital ecosystem, critical for unlocking economic, social, and environmental possibilities, opportunities for sustainable growth and development of the country. And when I look at that, that's similar to some of the things we saw last year in the new defense acquisition procedure. So independent of the sector, it allowed for increase of foreign direct investment. It was encouraging transfer of technology. It was creating opportunities for foreign OEMs, companies that have technology, to partner with Indian companies. At the same time, there was a boost in self-reliance initiatives that were creating incentives and in some ways barriers to externals, but incentives for foreign companies to engage. So I see it as an opportunity. From a Lockheed Martin perspective, we've got a lot of capabilities at space domain level, the ground-based, as well as analytics, that ultimately come together, to meet the requirements from a geospatial perspective. We have 2 successful joint ventures now celebrating 10-year anniversary with Tata, both in aircraft structures for C-130Js and also with Sikorsky on helicopters. And this is with Tata, and it's a 26% stake. So now they've increased foreign direct investment to 49 and 74%. It will be important to see how that then enables the growth of the ecosystem that supports this. So I can say from the defense perspective, it started out by importing components, assembling, and then delivering product globally. Through those joint ventures, they've exported over $600 million worth of content. That's real value for India and real value for the ecosystem of companies, over 300 suppliers that feed into that. So, if you translate that to other sectors, we're talking geospatial, leveraging that new policy and streamlining it and enabling companies like ourselves to invest in that area, incentivize transfer of technology, frankly, just accelerates the transformation in the sector that meets both India's self-reliant goals, but a part of that also is how you position and grow exports and grow the economy. So I think it's incredibly important. And the last element I'll reference is startups. Startups are at the heart of growth in the space domain and in many domains, but very much in the space domain when I look at it from both the US and in India perspective. Mobilizing startups to accelerate that technology development and really allow India to leapfrog possibly other countries in this domain space, I think is a tremendous opportunity.
Thank you so much, Bill. And that's sort of a great sort of inputs to hear of how the policy, the political will, how the systems have constantly been moving, maybe steadily, maybe a little slowly, but in the direction of achieving the goals, of balancing what we can achieve through foreign investment and collaboration and transfer of technology, and at the same time trying to achieve the goals of self-reliance. Jyotsna, very quickly, what do you think would really need to be done at a legal regulatory level after these guidelines have been notified to achieve the goals that have been set out here, the intent of these guidelines?
Sure. So I think the one thing that needs to be immediately done is for the existing prohibition on the export of digital maps above a scale of 1:250,000 to be done away with, because for foreign companies, particularly if they're going to be collecting this data, they're going to have it on a cloud. So if this restriction continues, then this liberalization in that sense is sort of redundant. So that is one of the changes that I see that need to immediately be carried out. As far as remote sensing data is concerned, I think this theme of self-reliance is of course prevalent in all of the new initiatives that are also coming out. So if you look at the the unmanned aircraft system rules that just came out on the 13th of March, they also talk about Indian companies having the right to operate these aircraft. So similarly, the draft as well as the existing remote sensing data policy talks about Indian companies. But even, I suppose that is something that is going to remain a constant theme. But the approval process, for instance, if I still need to get an approval to acquire satellite data, That's going to take away from the liberalization that I have under the geospatial guidelines that say I don't need an approval for anything up to the on-site spatial accuracy of 1 meter. So I think all of these requirements need to be harmonized, and these are a couple of examples of the policy as well as legal changes that need to take place.
Thanks, Jyotsna. Madhav, if you were to have a wish list, points 1, 2, 3, what would that be?
Yeah, I think I would echo what Jyotsna just talked about, right? The remote sensing data seems to be at a disadvantage today in India as compared to some of the, other technologies like LiDAR and all of that, where they have, better resolution and they don't have that constraint of, the government regulation coming in the way. So why should the remote sensing data be, penalized for it is a question that we need to ask ourselves, especially if some of the end user organizations can achieve a whole lot more improvement in their business processes by making use of remote sensing data more effectively than just jumping in for the more expensive option of looking at LiDAR and all of that. Yes, we understand that the GCP's improvised data cannot be exported. That's all good. Everybody will adhere to that. But there just needs to be a little bit more clarity around, what is the, dissemination mechanism, approval process, and most importantly, when talking about remote sensing in the context of India, the adherence to a certain set of SLAs is going to be crucial, because that was what was missing, and that was what was hurting the end user organizations quite drastically as it comes to leveraging the geospatial and remote sensing data. So those would be my wish list top. There's a lot more, but I'll stop there.
Great. Bill, this is kind of part as a question that's been raised and part what I was trying to sort of kind of sum up as before we move on to the next panel, because you specifically did mention, that startup sort of environment, which is very vibrant, not only across various sectors in India, but specifically, to my mind, and I agree with you, that it is one of the reasons why some of these reforms, these policy level reforms have really been pushed. And that's one of the reasons why perhaps I think even the government of India can think about putting in place a system for self-reliance, because there is it's a huge market in the startup space, which is really pushing the limits of technology, of innovation. We have these entities getting in data with regard to agricultural usage and how it's been over the last 10 or 15 years, and to make those forecasts, which is helpful for crop insurance companies, which is helpful to government for policies, etc. So I echo to a certain extent what Madhav just said in terms of also a requirement in parallel for there being a liberalized policy regime for the remote sensing data as well. And I would have thought that given the fact that it was earlier in time in terms of the draft policy, perhaps we would have seen that coming out simultaneous with this, if not earlier. But I mean, it's in the works and it should come out very quickly. The question, Bill, that I have to you is, do you think that there is an impediment in the manner in which the current policy narrative is being framed for companies, and specifically in the startup domain, for US companies to be able to do business in India, whether it is in the geospatial sort of services or otherwise?
Well, I think, well, just to start off, I mean, the space domain almost knows no boundaries, right, by definition. And so the space domain is a global marketplace that companies, to be competitive, productive, need to be able to develop capabilities, not just to meet India's needs, but broader than that, regionally and globally. And so the policy needs to be able to accommodate that. One, two, India is the innovation hub, right? It is the hub for so many key IT, artificial intelligence, machine learning companies. If they're not based here already, their center of innovation is based here, and probably both. And so you want the policy to help mobilize the business case, I think, in terms of trying to reduce those regulatory impediments that would preclude companies from being able to develop and compete on a global basis. Again, to meet India's needs, but also regional and global interests. And however that's shaped and formed, we see it in other sectors, whether it's the data privacy, data exchange issues that may limit it. It may be some of the tax regimes that may either enable or limit it or incentivize it. And maintenance, repair, and overhaul, it's a great example. Actually, it's a service business. And it's very, very hard for us to compete in India in maintenance, repair, and overhaul because of the level of taxation that was applied on it. So that was reduced and normalized in a way that can allow companies to set up and start up here to meet not just India's requirements, but global requirements. And you need scale to be able to do that. Leasing, another one, when you look at Gift City, leasing in Gujarat as an example. So you can see the government and states are implementing policies and incentives to allow companies to make their business case to grow. And I guess, without getting into the specifics, but it ties to, ultimately the application of how you're trying to use the data, right? You mentioned agriculture, weather. There's so many applications that actually, with machine learning and artificial intelligence as an enabler to drive capability and cost leverage, I think India is in a great position to do that, so long as the policies allow for that exchange of data beyond the borders of India.
Great. So this session, as well as the one on commercial space to follow, what we are trying to achieve is also look at, apart from the policy, what is the path towards commercial space collaboration between India and the US? Just very quick thoughts from the panelists with regard to how you think that the collaboration between these two countries and the companies across these two countries can help generically in the space domain and specifically in geospatial. Madhav, why don't you go ahead with this one first?
Yeah, I think there's plenty of potential there, and there was already a PECA agreement that was signed, between government of India and the US, particularly in the defense area, and there's plenty of scope to expand on that. And now with the Quad initiative taking off as well, there's plenty more that could be done. Not just with the US, but also with some of the other countries in the Quad formation. So I see this, the sky's the limit in terms of what India could leverage from the US and vice versa. I think there's a lot to be done, and these policy revisions that are coming, will lay the foundation for a lot of good things like this to happen.
Thanks. Will, your 2 bits on the collaboration?
Yes, thank you. I point to 2 examples. One, on a government-to-government basis, a framework of working through policy issues with the underpinning of industry. So the best example I can point to is the Aviation Cooperation Program. It was created in 2007, and with the FAA and the counterpart on the Ministry of Civil Aviation, it really helped streamline and remove friction from the system, if you will, to move forward on both policies but also incentives with industry engaging through that construct. And so it's incredibly effective at a time when there was rapid growth in the civil aviation sector. And then the other is business to business. Ultimately US companies and Indian companies working together through association or joint ventures, strategic partnering in a way that's enabled through the government policy.
Great. Jyotsna?
Thanks, Abhishek. So I am not as clued into all of these programs that have been spoken about, but I think technology transfer is something that could really help, because Indian companies have been very heavily reliant on foreign technologies thus far. And if the intent of all of these protections for Indian companies is to give them a sort of head start, then I think technology transfers would play a really key role.
Great. So just to kind of sum up the broad thoughts across this particular panel on geospatial specifically and commercial space and overall sense is that there has been consolidation, which is great. One doesn't have to look around for the various bases to try to figure out whether there's a licensing requirement or not. There is a little bit further need on some bits of clarity across aspects such as tax, possibly in terms of harmonizing the policies across remote sensing, as well as while it's been done with the geospatial guidelines. There is a need for greater amount of collaboration, maybe technology transfer between the US and India to take this forward. We should, while trying to achieve the objective of self-reliance, nevertheless try to balance the interest of business, and the vibrant startup community is certainly one which needs to be looked at in addition to the existing businesses to take this forward and achieve the goals in a balanced sort of fashion. Over to you, Lou, to take the Spacecom dialogue further. Thank you so much. Lou, you're on mute.
Lou, you're on mute.
You're still on mute. There we go.
I'll try it again. I'm going to thank you for the third time, Abhishek, and you deserve 3 thank yous. That was a great panel. And you must have read a few of my questions, because collaboration was really at the top of the list, and it's something we want to address here in this panel as well. So congratulations on getting the dialogue going. My name is Lou Zacharella. I am the Director of Innovation for the Space and Satellite Professionals Association. We are, for those of you who don't know us, we are the world's largest and oldest nonprofit trade association for professionals in the industry. We have been around for over 30 years. Our mission is really to identify talent and to bring it into the industry in a very aggressive way, because our industry is expanding at such a pace that the battle for talent is really top of mind. We also tell the story of the space and satellite community, and tell it in a way that I think is very exciting, because we try to put it within the framework of the collaboration of a world of professionals that are making the world better as they do their work. And if you go to bettersatelliteworld.com, you'll see stories and videos and podcasts about all the things that these professionals that you're going to hear from today have been doing in their careers to improve life on Earth. And so SSPI tells that story. We have chapters all around the world where industry professionals like the people you see here gather to talk, to do business. And so I wanted to thank everybody for coming today to talk and hopefully to do business. This webinar, as Jay said, is one of a series that is going to continue to push forward the dialogue between India and the United States that has been going on when we talk about human spaceflight since the early 1960s. So collaboration between our two nations is certainly not something that's new, but now we're trying to give, I would say, a new voice to an old truth. And that is, when great nations work together in areas of technology to improve the human condition, great things can happen. And so, as I said, what we're going to talk about today is how can that collaboration be shaped going forward, using human spaceflight and some of the other examples from the past to tell that story. And I think we've got 4 people who are supremely inclined to tell that story and qualified to do it. We've got Dr. David Alexander, who's the director of the Space Institute at Rice University. He's also the chair of the Greater Houston Partnership Aerospace and Aviation Community. And we'd like to welcome Dr. David Alexander. Also with us today is Mr. Saurabh Bhattacharya. Bhattacharya, I believe it is, and he'll correct me if I'm wrong, and then he can get Zacharella wrong if he wants one time.
You're absolutely correct.
Very good. He is the director at TWC, and we welcome him today. Also with us today is Catherine Martin. Catherine is with Spectrum and Service Rights with Access Partnership, and she's coming to us today from the East Coast of the United States, I believe. Welcome, Catherine. And finally, Steve Arnett, who is the Senior Vice President for Aerospace and Technology at Jacobs. So it's a very good group. What I wanted to do, Saurabh, is to start with you and to pick up on this idea of
Sorry, I can't hear you. I think you lost.
I think. And
Let me jump in. This is Jay Gullish. Catherine, firstly, can you put yourself on mute, Catherine? I think we're getting some feedback from your line. Thank you. Great. So why don't we start this off, Saurabh, and hopefully Lou can join. We'll see if I'll do some pinch hitting here. I'm certainly prepared for that. But one of the things that I saw in a previous webinar that you and I worked on was you sort of framed the overall Indian space industry and wanted to see if you could sort of share some of the trend lines, some of the size, some of the key markets that are growing, and just give us this stand to give us that context of the Indian space sector so that we can understand where the commercial element fits in.
Sure, thanks, Jay. I think, as any industry is structured, any space industry globally structured, Indian industry has a significant component of upstream, midstream, and downstream elements. But what I see as exciting is that while Indian industry was dominated by government with maximum business coming from that side, ISRO be playing the maximum and major role in this. What I see is that in spite, or I would say despite of any incentive from the government till last year, when government really started making significant changes, what I saw is that India had its self-grown private industry, maybe startups, I would say rather, coming up quite quickly across all these verticals. Now, we saw a lot of startups doing very innovative work, be it in the boosters to move the satellites on the orbit, or for that matter, launching satellites with minimum amount of funds available. They were doing incredible amount of work. So was the case when they were working on the downstream part of it. When they developed, we saw almost around 120 plus startups. So in fact, we started interacting with a lot of startups to create a common field for them to grow or connect with large industries. And we came across almost 120 startups coming out with some innovative and brilliant ideas, working on different type of sources and resources. So now what I see is that with the opening up of the industry, and I would draw your attention to somewhere in January 2020, just before this pandemic broke out, we came out with a paper where we said that the Indian industry needs a lot of incentives from government to open up, to grow further. And that is where we also came out with a number that we see as a potential that Indian industry, space industry, can become from what today it is at around $7 billion. In another 3 to 4 years, it can reach almost around $50 billion. Now, that's the size we saw of the industry. Thankfully, the government heard us, and it came out with a significant amount of changes in such a short span, which was not seen and which was unheard, I would say, in the previous decade or so, when the policy regime was more or less the same. Now, with that, what I see is there's a lot of excitement, a lot of investments coming in. We are almost in touch with almost 7 to 8 investment funds which are keen, and global funds who are keen to invest in India, connect with these startups, these industries to promote or to help them grow. What also we see is from the government side, government is willing to work on technology transfer. I know one of the panelists in the previous panel spoke about technical transfer, and I see that government is very clear in terms of guidelines and procedures to proceed with technology transfer also, and it has already started. And this year, probably we will see first of such cases coming out soon from the stables of NSIL, which is the new entity which they have formed, where we will see private technical demonstrations happening on technology which evolved through ISRO and the government-based entities. So there's a lot of excitement, a lot of changes which is happening in this industry.
Yeah.
And
very good. Saurabh, can you hear me? I think I'm back.
Yes, you are audible. Please, go.
Thank you for carrying that for me, and that was a great setup. I heard the last 3/4 of it. And so, as you say, the government now is more engaged in the collaborative area. David, I want to turn it over to you, because what we find, certainly in the United States, is that when you begin to build the kinds of ecosystems that we're talking about, that creates these industries, this kind of economic growth that, of course, India is looking for, the academic sector plays a significant role. the intellectual capital that is gathered working in collaboration with national and local governments, as well as the private sector, becomes key to those ecosystems as they form. And it sounds like that's going to continue to flourish or going to begin to accelerate in India, as Saurabh set us up to hear. Are there any insights you can give us from your work at Rice University that might be useful in understanding how the academic collaboration can also cross over into this area?
Yeah, well, thank you, Lou, and thank you for the invitation to participate. I think this is a very important set of conversations that we're starting out on. I think what's happening, I mean, one of the, particularly when you think about commercial space, the opportunities for students are opening up far more than in the past. You know, in the United States, it would be, we want to go work for NASA and maybe one of the big contractors. Now there's so many opportunities and there's so many different job descriptions. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to move the space economy forward. And so one of the challenges there, of course, is to create that content for our students and to give them the opportunities when they graduate. The other thing I would add to that is the fact that I think, and maybe it's just my age, but I think that this generation of students that we're teaching now, and this is true across the world, and particularly in an entrepreneurial country like India as well, is they're looking, our students are not looking for the traditional content. They're looking for, they're far more multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary than we ever were. They're looking to solve real problems and help society and help the world in general. And so those are challenges to the universities because our standard, going to the classroom, learn some physics, isn't sufficient anymore. And so we have to sort of create those opportunities around it. At Rice, for instance, we have a leadership program. And so we actually have leadership coaching for our students. We have an entrepreneurial program. We have a professional science master's in space studies, where the opportunity there is not to do a research thesis, but to combine the technical courses with business and management and entrepreneurial courses. And we're even adding a data science component. So we have to get cleverer and we have to get more proactive in creating that next generation, because again, they want to go out and do their own thing, not sort of sign up for a 50-year career with a company. So I think that's something that we're all learning as we go. And I think, you know, the more we collaborate and we learn from others, we have a number of Indian students in that program, for example, because of the importance of space in India. And I think one of them's even listening right now. And so I think that's where the collaboration comes in, and where that next generation needs to have those on-ramps into the industry. So I think there's a lot that can be done going forward.
Yeah, and there are a lot of opportunities, as you say, because as that industry expands, different capabilities are going to be required. I mean, this is going to be, you know, depending on whose numbers you look at, a $1.1 trillion business, and it's going to impact economies in cities and places around the world. Steve, you know, sort of carrying that over to you as well, commercial spaceports and accelerators for getting us to space rapidly have become economic engines in part of the world and continue to pop up. So what you know, our colleagues have said has come to pass. How important will these be to the ecosystems going forward? And do you envision something like this, again, crossing borders so that India can learn from the United States, you know, how to accelerate the growth of that entrepreneurial class, which is going to be an anchor to future employment and everything else that's virtuous?
Yeah, thanks, Lou. Just to add to the other panelists, really pleased to be a part of the conversation, a part of this great panel. So thanks to USIBC and the SSPI for putting on this great event, and really appreciate your question, Lou. And just to take a quick minute to introduce to the audience Jacobs and our role in the space ecosystem. We're really proud over, I mean, Jacobs, you may be aware, is, you know, broadly based, everything from health to infrastructure, but certainly space, defense, cybersecurity. And we really believe the breadth of our engagement in today's world we view it as a strength from the standpoint of commercial space, because we're so closely connected to many of the applications that are improving the lives of humans throughout the world. And so for more than 70 years, we've been heavily engaged in the U.S. in the space enterprise, and we're proud to be NASA's #1 provider of technical and engineering services. And this idea of some carry around maybe of government space programs and commercial space programs, I think it's not so black and white, actually. And that's what our experience has told us. Even if you take an example like NASA Kennedy Space Center in Florida, which many of you may be certainly familiar with, and over the last several years, we Jacobs have been supporting NASA there to convert that from a NASA-only dedicated infrastructure to, in truth, a multi-user spaceport. Many of the launches in the U.S. you see today from different launch service providers coming out of NASA Kennedy. And so I think it's very much a time of innovation and kind of thinking of even an idea, maybe it's simple but powerful, shared use of infrastructure. And then if you think about India and the great space credentials and capabilities there, and certainly a lot of the infrastructure and capability exists. So it does feel like, there could be a lot of not only great collaboration, but sharing of best practice and how to derive maximum value as we, grow this space ecosystem.
Lou, you are on mute.
Lou, you're on mute.
I'm going to come back, Steve, and at the end of our discussion, ask you for maybe a point on how that can happen, how that collaboration can take place. So thank you for that, for those remarks. Catherine, speaking of things that are emerging, I saved you for last because the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India's IoT recently said that the IoT consultation around international best practices for SATCOM service providers could boost the rise of services and new businesses if the technology is implemented properly. Now, I think that's a big deal because IoT is obviously a big deal. So what are your thoughts on that? How best to introduce technologies and best practices to the market like IoT, which is such an inevitable part of the space and satellite industry going forward that no one can ignore it?
Thank you, Lou, and good day to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Whether I'm last or not, it's always an honor to address a crowd about a topic near and dear to my heart, which is essentially the ability to roll out new products and services and to take advantage of technology to the betterment of all. So my name is Catherine Martin. I'm here on behalf of Access Partnership, an international consultancy with offices around the world. I'm based in Washington, but our company is headquartered in London. And for the past 20 years, we've been looking at new technologies and how to best roll them out and provide market access in a way that is fair. We speak often of fair tech and the need to drive that. When it comes to satellite services and the tremendous growth that we've seen over the past, past couple of decades, honestly, there is so much that comes to mind. And Lou, you had mentioned the recent, and by recent I mean, I think it was released on March 12th, a consultation within the TRAI on seeking guidance on the licensing framework for satellite-based connectivity for IoT services, Internet of Things, which is essentially a low bitrate applications. And as was noted in the geospatial discussion, there are so many applications, agriculture, maritime, trucking, machine to machine, it's limitless, the types of applications that can be used to support new industries. And I think with that comes the need in some ways to, I won't say refresh the regulatory framework, but to take a look anew to make sure that regulations, when they are set up, do try to keep it simple, try to enable new products and services to get to market. Some of the questions within the consultation ask about, do we need an entirely new framework or should we just update the one that we have? Should we limit it to certain frequency bands? Should there be limits on who can provide these services? Should we enable domestic satellite capacity to be used, or should we look to you know, other types of satellite capacity from other countries. And I think in my mind, at least, it all kind of comes down to trying to keep things simple and try to develop a framework that looks towards more products and services being able to, you know, enrich the broader, you know, economy and ecosystem. So I would not think it would be useful to put limits on frequency bands, like only the L band or only the KU band or only the KA band. You know, I think many satellite networks in different bands are able to offer those services. Should it be limited to just, you know, a certain Indian satellite in satellite capacity or others? I think it, you know, we should look to alternate. So anyway, that's kind of it, you know, at a basic level, I think to keep it simple and to allow for other uses.
Yeah. Well, I think that's really important to keep it simple. Saurabh, is what Catherine's saying making sense in terms of, again, as India opens, finding some simplicity, maybe in an area like IoT, which is, as we say, is such an inevitable mover going forward, that maybe that becomes sort of the beta test for how to create the kinds of regulations, resolve some of the tensions between incumbency and innovation, and maybe a fear of opening up?
Yeah, I think, you know, we need to look at also some ancillary activities which have taken place in the past. Now, if you look at it, that India has right now opened up its telecom sector for all sort of investment, foreign investment, up to 100% can be invested, 50%, almost 49% through direct route or through a permission, the rest of the entire 100%. Now, what it means is that with the and then you look at the SATCOM policy which has come through now, and obviously this IoT policy. Now, with the demand getting created for IoT, if you look at the intent which is mentioned in the policies, is that it knows that there is a huge investment which is coming on the way. If you look at the IoT consultation paper, it has already spoken of OneWeb and similar the examples of how they are interacting with the governments in the respective countries, be it with FCC and else. So what India intends to do is to replicate these best practices here now. And with other incentives in place, like allowing full investments coming in this sector, what I see is that there's a lot of convergence, a lot of possibilities of this sector becoming a potential area for further growth in the space industry. So that's the way I look at it.
Very good. Well, Dr. Alexander, how do you look at it? I was following very closely Prime Minister Modi's 100 New Smart Cities initiative a couple of years ago, and I'm not quite sure where that's evolved to. But the first thing that came to my mind was, boy, this is very exciting. Collaboration is going to be very incredibly important, and maybe our industry has a role to play there. But picking up on what Catherine and Saurabh have been saying, what do you think the points of entry would be to create those kind of ecosystems that would make 100 cities in India just begin to flourish and collaborate with the rest of the world?
Well, I think it's very interesting. Obviously, regulation becomes a real problem, and particularly if we think even further in the human spaceflight side of things. But I gave a talk in Scotland recently to a digital conference, and I told everyone at the conference that they were all space companies, whether they knew it or not. Sure. And the reason for that is because, and particularly when it comes to human spaceflight, when you think about the technologies that are required to keep a machine or a human functioning in space, it's everything. It's everything from the digital side to the electronic side to the sustainable water reclamation, power, all of these different things. And one of the things I'm very keen to promote is the concept of the technology shouldn't be tailored just to an application. It should be, the technology should be, there are people working in medical imaging that could be used for Earth remote sensing. There are people working in new battery technologies that could be used in hydrogen fuel cells that could be used in cars or in space. And so I think being able to sort of create that infrastructure, the technologies that you would put into a smart city, since you brought up smart cities, could easily be translated to a habitat on the moon, for example, some of them. And so just having a broader mindset and knowing what your technology capabilities are allows you to then to expand into other areas, either from space to terrestrial applications, or from terrestrial technologies to be applied to space. The challenges, of course, in space, as you know, are quite difficult in some cases. It's an environment that doesn't like us to be there. But again, by asking those hard questions, you have the means to improve your technologies for the application on the ground. So I think a lot of this comes together. And if you can give me 1 second, I think where the two panels come together, the human space flight and the geospatial, is where the increased commercial use of low Earth orbit. And that's all. We've been talking about the application side, but there's also the in-space side. And so there's a lot of discussion going forward about in-space servicing. And I like to call it the 4 R's. There's the reuse, there's the repair, there's the refuel, and there's the remove. And it's the remove where there's an overlap with human spaceflight, because if we don't handle the space debris problem, then we have trouble actually doing what we're hoping to do in space. And that space debris problem is an international collaboration problem, because the regulations, the legislation, who's responsible, that all has to be negotiated between well-meaning countries. And I think that's where some of the major countries in space plays a big role. Of course, that includes the United States and India. So there's a huge slew of tentacles coming out of this conversation that we don't have time for, but they are all overlapped, and we are all space companies, whether we like it or not.
Well, I love to hear that. Steve and Catherine, I'm going to go to you guys quickly because we're pretty much out of time, but it's all about connecting the dots. You know, as Dr. Alexander said, I mean, Steve Jobs actually defined creativity as just merely connecting dots. He said that's what it is. That sounds an awful lot like innovation to me, what Dr. Alexander was just describing, and at least enabling it. Can you think of one example of innovative collaboration that might be brought forward so that the two groups
Sure. And I'll just quickly, I really appreciated Dr. Alexander's remarks, and maybe just a quick comment for sake of time to build on it. I know how that's coming to life within our company. Just a quick synopsis. If you look today in the U.S. and Jacobs, there are maybe 8,000 plus or minus people that are really dedicated to the space sector. But any large multinational company, I mean, India is a strategic part of our company. We have well over 2,000 people there today that are delivering solutions to the rest of the world. Some of the most, and while that has been mainly for infrastructure and transportation, those types of projects, increasingly that's smart infrastructure, it's smart cities. And what we've seen, just as Dr. Alexander referenced, a convergence of all that expertise to the solution of tomorrow. And so we very much believe that, and you think about commercial space, and we're excited to be there with a large presence, a high-tech, workforce there that can leverage and take advantage of the space expertise. And I think a lot of the things that have worked in terms of academic engagement, as Dr. Alexander mentioned, and company and government strategic investment, it's very much coming to life in India with already a great capability there to start from. So we're very excited about the future. And even just to give you a specific example and try and answer your question. Yeah. NASA has really built their program around international partnerships, and even where we've done things with the ECLS system we support to keep the astronauts in great shape in orbit, some of the water purification technology, we've found great opportunities to leverage that here on Earth in places, and it's just countless. So I think there's a lot to be had there, Lou.
Thank you, Stephen. You're right. We could go on and talk about that for another hour and bring up a lot of other examples. Catherine, last opportunity to you to talk about that. If there is a point of collaboration where we might continue this dialogue and have both India and the US say, this is a great place for us to continue to explore because it meets all the criteria of self-reliance, economic growth, implementing technology where it needs to, and something we're passionate about at SSPI, making the world a darn better place. What would you say going out is the best example, the best way for us to think about that?
Well, One area, it is to echo what Dr. Alexander had mentioned, I think the sustainability of space is an issue that is becoming more top of mind among many people. 10 years ago, you didn't hear much chatter about orbital debris or anything. Now it really is at the top of minds of a lot of leading experts in the industry broadly, not just satellite operators, but others. And I think that area is ripe for some innovation from a regulatory and economic perspective. I like that there's a fair amount of money invested in how to retrieve the 4Rs that were mentioned, but I also think, like globally, there's scope for countries and forward-thinking, countries like India and the United States and others to come together and really figure out how to tackle this problem. And I think that is where I think we could put some energy and some creativity, connect some dots, if you will.
Yeah, let's keep connecting the dots. Well, you four have certainly done it for us today, and I really appreciate you coming by to do it. If there have been some great chats on the side as well, which again you can look at, and they've been answering questions as we've been asking them. So this has been a great panel for us. Jay, I'm going to turn it back over to you. If anybody wants to get in touch with Saurabh, David, Catherine, and Steve, you can do it through SSPI or SSPI India, or this man on the screen, Jay Gullish. Jay, over to you. Thanks.
Great. Thank you to Lou and Abhishek, and what a great panel. I'm going to ask all of our discussants, our panelists, if you wouldn't mind just popping in your name and a contact information into the chat box. And that way, if the participants want to reach out to you, they have a direct avenue to do that. I'm also going to ask all of our speakers to come online right now for the questions and answers period. And I'm going to start, and I'm going to encourage everybody to raise your hand if you have a question. Please come in. We really want this to be a conversation. We want to create an expert group, a community of interest. And as we push forward to hopefully the U.S.-India Civil Space Dialogue at the end of the year, we'd really like to see the avenues for commercial activity, and the larger our ecosystem, the more powerful we are to really ultimately enhance the space programs and industry on both sides. I'm going to start with my question to Steve, and I really want to follow up with something around space ports. We know that in human spaceflight, in the commercial element, the role of commercial spaceports has been quite important, but also a really long time in its coming. And I know Jacobs is really involved in that sort of infrastructure. Can you sort of walk through just a little bit of how commercial spaceports have evolved from, FAA regulatory support to FAA regulation to those sorts of things? And I know, Dr. Alexander, perhaps you can follow up with that, because I know in Houston there's a push for a commercial spaceport as well. So Steve, over to you.
Yes, it's a great question, Jay, and very much a current topic. And I think that, as no doubt many of those tuned into the forum are aware, there are, scores of activities in various state of maturation across the globe. Many countries looking into it. There's been a lot of exciting recent development in the UK, for instance. And then there's a handful of countries around the world, India, of course, included, with its great heritage of getting things into space, that have, the technology know-how. And so, but focusing on the commercial spaceports, trying to get the regulatory environment right. The FAA has, I think, been a leader there, trying to craft some of the policy that can hopefully be leveraged in a more global way. And I know that they have been very active in reaching out to other countries to try to put that framework together, because I think it's much like the sustainable environment of space. We are going to need some type of a global framework to kind of govern how commercial spaceports work. And so we are very much involved with a lot of those entities and helping to sort through the issues. And I think what's been useful, much whether you look at ISRO or NASA and capitalizing on the successful experience of the past, what does it take to make a place like Kennedy, NASA Kennedy as an example, a place that multiple launch service providers can use, and how can that translate to the commercial environment? So there's a lot of development underway right now, a lot of exciting initiatives in countries throughout the world, and we're glad to be supporting a lot of those. But hopefully that addresses your question a bit.
Go ahead, David. Thank you. If you have some comments.
Yeah. No, thanks for that, Stephen. I think so. Houston Spaceport got its license in June of 2015, and it was the 10th licensed commercial spaceport by the FAA. There's now 12. And a few years ago, we set up a thing called the Global Spaceport Alliance, and we have an annual summit, and we have all of the spaceports in the US represented, the commercial spaceports and some of the government ones. And we have something like 6 different countries participating, and we're hoping to grow that. I think that just 2 points I would like to make. One is in Houston, we have 7 million people around Ellington Field, which houses the Houston Spaceport, so we cannot launch rockets. And so our concept of a spaceport is much more a space center, a place where the things we talked about earlier happen, the innovation, the technology. There's a company building one of the NASA cargo landers for the moon. And there's another company who got the first contract to build a commercial space station being housed at the spaceport. So they provide an attraction because space is such a draw. They provide an attraction for some of the things we talked about earlier, this technology and innovation. The other comment I would like to make with regards to the international aspect, I was working a little bit with the UK when they were putting forward their spaceport plans. And the challenge, and this is where government becomes really important, the challenge is legislation, licensing, and liability. I keep doing these alliteration things. I apologize, but I guess I'll call them the 3 L's. But one of the challenges is how you handle liability, particularly when it's a commercial center, how you legislate for that. And that's where the FAA and the Commercial Space Transportation Office and now the Department of Commerce in the US have been reaching out and trying to share some common ideas and best practices. So it's a growing area. There's a lot of people in Southeast Asia looking to Australia because Australia has been active in the launch market or trying to. And I think this is a growing industry and perhaps it's not an industry yet, but it will be soon. And there's many different aspects. Again, you could paint different pictures on what a spaceport does and where it's going. So I think it's a great topic. And the launch part is a big deal, and that's what Steve referenced. And but putting it all together is what we need to be thinking going forward about what a specific strength a spaceport has in a given location, and that's what we're struggling with in the US too. Again, a long conversation that could be had, but I'll stop there.
Perhaps another webinar in our series. Catherine, I'm going to turn over to you, and I want to just commend you on your depth use of the microphone. Access Partnership recently published a report on cybersecurity and cloud technology and how a lot of activities is moving to cloud. Some of our panelists mentioned how the space industry and the satellite industry is using the cloud. Can you sort of share a little bit about some of the trends? And then I'm going to ask one of our Indian counterparts to see, to sort of respond as a follow-up to see if there's some compatibility in the global trend lines of this industry with some other policies around, data that India is looking at.
Thank you, Jay. I think I'm off mute. Yes, within Access Partnership, we have been providing and looking at many different elements as technology is moving forward. We have looked at how, with the, rise of cloud-based platforms and services and essentially migration globally towards storing and accessing information on the cloud, how that is impacted and secured. And I think there are a lot of analogies to how we think about space and how we think about satellite communications in particular, how we protect that. So some of the trends that we had identified were, captured in the report. But I think there's some scope for looking at the, not synergies, but kind of the connections between the two. because cybersecurity and the protection of information and ensuring that it is not at risk, I think is critical for everybody as we move into more of a data-centered world. So thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah, no, thank you. And if you want to, I'll post that report for people to take a look at as well.
Appreciate it.
Saurabh, you've been taking a look at a lot of the industry sector, and you mentioned that there's a lot of investors coming in. I'm curious to know with sort of two things. One, the geospatial has, limits on who can be party to who can be an Indian entity. And then also the issue of data localization. Are either of those two issues really inhibitants, or do we see this as a stepping stone where, we've seen this in other sectors that one of the presenters mentioned that, in telecoms, we sort of started here and took another step and another step. Sort of what you're thinking and how some of these startups and investors are looking at the market.
So I know India has these laws and rules like localization and the challenges around it, but I don't see it as an inhibition, something which is preventing the industry to grow. What I also see is that the laws have to be looked in perspective. Now, there are other laws which allow you as an organization and as a foreign organization, institution to establish itself in India, register itself as an Indian entity, and then probably work with assets which are foreign assets. For example, if you look at the space policy, it's very clear as the SATCOM policy. It talks about that every asset has to be registered in India, even if it's a foreign asset. But then you don't look at it in one prism. You have to also look at that if these assets have to be owned by an Indian, there are laws which also says that these organizations which wants to own this up can also register as an Indian entity. So for example, what I see is that tomorrow, for example, Starlink has applied for registration in India for its services. So we see Starlink opening up as an Indian subsidiary, maybe 100% owned subsidiary called Starlink Private Limited or something like in India. And that thereafter registering these Starlink assets, the orbital assets in India within Indian entities and delivering the services. So point is that there are enablers, there are needs, there are security concerns, national needs, which is there with every country when US will have those needs also. But there are ways and mechanisms to also handle those needs through proper channels. And that also has been created and framed within the country. So that's the way I look at it.
Thank you. A question for your tax attorneys for another day. If you have to register your assets in India, does that bring tax liabilities for your global assets for something like a LEO in the Indian context? Do you know that offhand? Or maybe you could reach out to your PwC tax colleagues and sort of, I would imagine that might be a concern that you are moving assets from one jurisdiction to India to get a license and then a tax bill pops up for global assets.
Honestly, I'm not a tax expert, so obviously we will have to refer to them. But but as far as the policies are concerned, I see the clarity in the way the firms can operate in India.
Okay, great. Thank you. Bill, I'm going to come to you because, I mean, Lockheed Martin, obviously one of the really largest companies in the United States, and you do a ton of work throughout the entire U.S. space ecosystem, NASA, NOAA, I imagine USGS, FAA, and elsewhere. If you could share a little bit about your thinking about how the company views commercial space and how you both work with the government, but then also work with your other partners in sort of that position of being a driver of commercial space, but also someone who has to manage sort of diverse supply chains as well.
Yeah, sure, Jay. I think when we look at commercial space, and you mentioned when we look at it internationally, we're trying to work through partnerships, but it's through all aspects. It's holistic. It's at the satellite level, at the launch level. It's various sizes from the smallest satellite, the LM50, for some remote sensing capability, all the way up through the LM2100. And so it covers a full range in terms of a portfolio of capabilities. And then the mission solutions component probably is, equal or most important, because it's ultimately going to take all of that data and make it actionable, whether it's for a government customer, whether it's for the commercial sector. It really comes down to the level of fidelity and capability that you bring in terms of an integrated mission solution capability. So it's an end-to-end solution. And then, as I mentioned, working with partners. We have a long history of working, of course, with NASA, with international partnerships, whether it's in the human space flight or in commercial space. And oftentimes it's working underneath a government-to-government construct. We may be supporting a NASA relationship with ISRO, for instance, in the future, or a NASA relationship in another country called UAE or KSA. And so we're bringing the kind of the industrial capability, and in times maybe transfer of technology, when we work with our counterpart partners on the industry, the industry side. And that's why I kind of mentioned earlier, as we're trying to establish a footprint in a new country, oftentimes it's helpful to have that government-to-government construct. I referenced the Aviation Cooperation Program. Could we have a space cooperation program that gives us both the headroom and the top cover of a G2G that then industry can come under, that works collaboratively on both sides. So that's just maybe putting a finer point on it from an India opportunity perspective.
Thank you very much. I want to see if any of our participants have any final questions. We do have one from the audience. Josh Davis. Josh, do you want to come on screen and maybe ask our Indian speakers if they have thoughts about how Indian companies might react?
Sure. I'm an economic developer with the Greater Houston Partnership focused on aerospace, commercial space, and aviation. Just want to hear from the panelists. What can I, as an economic developer, do to attract India's commercial space sector to the U.S.? We want to be the first place that the sector goes outside of India, and any ideas are welcome. Thank you.
Great, and maybe we can ask, our Indian colleagues here, Saurabh Joshna and Abhishek, to respond to that, because they're closest to, the Indian companies.
Saurabh, would you like to take that first?
Yeah, sure, Abhishek. Thanks. On a lighter note, I think you don't need to do anything. Indian government has done enough tax complications. It has created that organizations have already been moving out and establishing there. So I know that a lot of startups have operations running out of Singapore or from Paris, for that matter. They have been transacting because of the complicated tax laws which we see in India, at least for the domestic space industry. So if just to give you on a perspective that for an Indian satellite startup to launch a satellite from an Indian rocket, it will have to pay an 18% plus GST. I don't know whether it has changed off late or not, but it is 18% GST, the tax which it has to pay. Whereas a foreign company entity, if it wants to launch satellite through an ISRO rocket, it will be exempted from these taxes. So yes, there are a lot of challenges which are there, which has already created some complications, specifically around tax and other areas. But I think the best part is that what I see today is that Indian industry, that there's a huge demand for services in agriculture, be it in infrastructure, be it in fisheries. We have a lot of demand which is coming up, and that demand cannot be met from homegrown technologies. While we see a lot of downstream organizations coming up and trying to serve that demand, but then that downstream organization also requires high-end technology. And that is where what I see is a point of collaboration and the area where economic developers can create those right incentives and inputs for transferring or at least helping the Indian startups acquire those technologies in order to serve the customer market in India. So I think that can be an indicator. How does it happen? How do we take it forward? That is for the policy makers to define, and then maybe not at this forum. We will within sufficient time. I don't think we have enough time to talk about it, but I think that is the area where we have to look at.
Yeah, Josh, this is Lou Zacharella. I can tell you for a fact, though, if you've got an ecosystem in Houston where you can demonstrate that it is a good move for a company to establish their North American presence, in your city, then you've got an advantage. Because I know from my work with the Intelligent Community Forum that they go to places where fundamentally 6 things exist. It's the basic infrastructure, a good knowledge workforce, pools of innovation that they can jump into right away, sustainability, and also the ability to go to these places, find investment, and also use the platforms to market themselves to the rest of the country. So if your economic development group, which is tasked with bringing in businesses and investment, can accomplish those things, you've actually got an edge. And I would think Houston would have a significant edge when it comes to commercial space entities from other places coming in. The Taiwanese, by the way, are looking for partnerships in our country or in the United States right now in this area. So I'm happy to have that conversation with you offline.
Thank you very much. And if anyone
Jyotsna
would like to contact afterwards, my contact information is in the chat. So thanks for the insights.
Jyotsna, I know that you're running short on time. You need to jump off into another call. So if you have a couple of thoughts on this, perhaps you can chime in and then.
Sure, thanks, Abhishek. And just to sort of add, because I have been receiving a flurry of queries from some of my foreign clients asking about what these liberalizations mean in terms of geospatial data and how can they collaborate then with Indian entities who thus far have been so reliant on foreign technology. So I think given the restrictions on Indian ownership and control, setting up a subsidiary here is not really going to help. But I think this does open up a lot of opportunities for collaboration, again, in the form of technology licensing or transfer, because, we have to admit that India is a bit far behind in this race. So we're finally catching up because now the market has opened up, the regulations have opened up. But I think that it will be very hard to do without integrating with sophisticated foreign technology. So I think it does open up the room for collaboration, perhaps in a non-equity construct, because you can't actually do it through equity.
Just adding that last bits to it, of course, because the fact that the focus of this question also is to attract the Indian companies in the Houston area and perhaps to look at a setting up base in the US as well. I think and because of the fact that we work a lot with the startups in India, as anyone would tell you, perhaps patience is not just a virtue, but it is a necessity. So therefore, a lot of the startups that have the wherewithal and the staying power and the long-term perspective of trying to be homegrown and working within the existing ecosystem, those people, of course, stay the course and continue to work either as an arm's length with ISRO or otherwise. But a lot of these startups which have innovative ideas and which want to make those implementations right away and not wait for that sort of longer period of time, look at opportunities overseas to set up base and carry forward their activities. And sort of mentioned France is one of the destinations. I've seen people set up base in Germany, in the Netherlands. Singapore clearly is one of the preferred destinations, perhaps for tax reasons as well. So in addition to the factors mentioned by Lou a little while ago, I would think that there is a lack currently of information on how it would be beneficial for someone to set up base in US and specifically in the Houston area. So that if that interface is created, perhaps with the partnership with SSPI, and the India chapter, so that people know about that sort of those advantages and the tax element, the ease of incorporating business and doing business, and of course clearly the aspect that if the long-term goal is to be in India and utilize whatever opened up policy regulatory regime will offer to the businesses, then how can that cooperation collaboration work? I think with those aspects it could be clearly an advantageous situation.
Great. And with that, really want to thank our panelists. This was a great conversation. I want to end where I began. We're trying to develop a community here that we can look at the bilateral community from US and India so that we could propel the space industry. We want to work with our government counterparts as part of their dialogues And finally, SSPI and USIBC, we're really excited about a series of conversations on these topics. So do please feel free to reach out to us. And I want to thank everybody for their time. Please stay safe. And we will make this video available shortly. So again, to great guests, great moderators, and thank you to all the participants as well. And be well and have a nice day.
Thanks, Jake.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jay. Appreciate it. Take care.
Bye, folks. Thank you, everybody.